have a guest today. This guest is someone who's been on the show before, and last time he was on talking about Star Wars, and he is both best known for talking about Star Wars. Today he's going to be talking about a new book he has called All Up. It is a book about man's adventure to get to the moon, the creation of space exploration, the history of it, and the characters involved from the late 1800s through getting to the moon. It's a fascinating book, and the author is someone who's been on before. It is Mr. Jonathan Rinzler, formerly of Lucasfilm, where you knew him from the making of Star Wars, Complete Indiana Jones, and so on. But now he is here talking about his new book, All Up. So without further ado, let's listen to Kayla and I as we talk to Mr. Jonathan Rinzler.
Hello there, pathetic earthling. This is Tallest Red from Invader Zim.
Hey, kiddos, this is Handsome Jack.
The Baroness from Dragon Age.
This is Poison Ivy.
Hi, this is Alex Fulton Regan, voice of the Inquisitor from Dragon Age Inquisition, and you're listening to Bombad Radio.
Bombad Radio.
You're listening to Bombad Radio.
So, welcome back to the show, Mr. Jonathan Rinzler. You were on most recently a year ago or so. Back then you were talking Star Wars. And today you have a very different project for us. So why don't you talk a little bit about your new book that's due out this Thursday, the 25th of May, All Up.
Thank you. Yes, I'm happy to be here and happy to talk about it. All Up is really a book about the first space age. And I wrote it to inspire people and entertain people because I realized in my own sort of journey to this book and researching and writing it, that most people really don't know anything about the space age or the people who were involved, like Verner von Braun and Sergei Korolev on the Russian side, and Jack Parsons, who was this crazy explosive expert who co-founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and just so many amazing events and stories and interconnections that kind of coalesced and became what we call the first space age, but which started with Robert Goddard, the United States, and then the V2 rocket in Germany, and then the Apollo, Mercury, Gemini programs. It's such an amazing story, and your average person just doesn't really know anything about it. And I include myself in that group. And but I wanted to learn, and as I learned, I realized this is an amazing story, which is only told usually in documentaries and nonfiction books. And so they can only get at it from a certain limited angle. And I thought if I did a historical fiction novel, I could really delve into a lot of the stuff that usually isn't touched upon, and which I think I wrote to you about in an email, which I discuss as we go forward.
Yeah, and your book is rather timely as well, because even in recently, as far as cinema goes, you've had Hidden Figures, which was much more popular than people would have thought about a small aspect of the space race. You even have little space episodes in Legends of Tomorrow for comic book fans and so on. So it's stayed timely, but your book is definitely much more broad, where most of these films or stories pick apart a little tiny aspect of it that they think would be most dramatic, while yours takes definitely a much more a larger approach and a more overview approach of the whole story, which I definitely appreciate.
Right, well, yeah, I don't know how much you've read of the book, but I tried to take, I guess, the largest point of view. And then, of course, it is becoming more topical as the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11 comes up in a couple of years, and the SpaceX, and there's more talk about a manned or peopled mission to Mars, which, well, actually, that's another subject, but they did do tests, I believe, that said that women would actually be better astronauts than men, but that wasn't possible back then. But history being as it is, the book is mainly about men, and then most of the engineers were men back in the day, and the main characters are. But it should be a book for everyone, and as a species, it's very important, I think, to sort of re-energize the idea of space travel in the minds of everyone, because I think it's only natural for us to want to go to other planets and explore and, if possible, set up little colonies. maybe do it differently than colonies have been set up before.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it raises all kinds of interesting issues.
And I appreciate you definitely talk quite a bit about the German contribution to space travel, because a lot of the times, especially nowadays, anytime anyone mentions anything that Nazi Germany did, we like to demonize them. But in lots of fields of science, be it rocketry, be it psychology, what they gave us is still like fundamental to what we use today, and they made advances that we might not ever have done, but because they came from a regime that was terrible, we tend to try to gloss over that aspect of history or tend to avoid it. While you definitely talk about the contributions of a lot of German scientists, especially with the V rockets and so on, that really led us into space.
Yeah, I mean it's controversial and but really interesting to see. I like to look at it again from sort of a general species point of view. The way that a lot of invention happens, for better or for worse, is through war. And World War II was a kind of crucible in which we're still coming to grips with all the different things that changed because of that war, in terrible, horrible ways, but a lot of times, oddly, for the better. And, you had Robert Goddard, who made a lot of the most important advances in America, but the American Army just wasn't interested in what he was doing. They were interested in jet-assisted takeoff, and they basically got a couple groups working on that, one of which included Jack Parsons, who's a major character in the book. And Goddard is in there too, but because he wanted to work by himself, he kind of, sort of recused himself in some ways from the bigger highway of history. Whereas Werner von Braun and the German army, which basically then worked for the Nazis, it's like, well, we can do rockets because the Versailles Treaty doesn't outlaw those specifically. And they were also very out-of-the-box thinkers and dreamers and maniacs. And also, let's face it, that group at Peenemünde, they really wanted to win the war, too. They had a very narrow view of how things were going in the world, and they thought, it was perfectly fine to, if regrettable, to bomb Antwerp and London and kill civilians in the names of winning the war. And we were saying, and it's still interesting because it's debated, how effective was the V2 as opposed to massive bombing raids. And you have Eisenhower basically saying if the V2 had been perfected 6 months earlier, we might have delayed the war indefinitely. So it's all, I just found super, super interesting. And I wanted to dramatize it so that people could kind of get the most important and the most exciting elements from it in its fictionalized form, and go from the beginning, from the very first liquid fuel rocket launch on Aunt Effie's farm. Hopefully I'm not getting that name wrong. all the way up to Apollo 11. It's just, I think it's the most exciting, most amazing adventure in modern history. And you go into a bookstore, and there's not even a book section on space travel and all of the Apollo missions and all the stuff that's going on now, Mars, rover, and everything. It's just, I guess there's an astronomy section if you're lucky.
Yeah, well, you're lucky if you find a bookstore in general these days.
Right? No kidding.
But
here in Anchorage, we've only got a Barnes & Noble. Like, there's no locally owned places anymore. Okay, there's one used bookstore, I guess, but other than that, that's it.
Yeah, here in Flagstaff, there's a Barnes & Noble and a campus one. Beyond that, we go to the library. There's two of them.
Yeah, well, we're going to go this afternoon to a little bookstore out in Willits, which is a small town. They're still around. It's not over yet. Physical books are not going away. Working at Lucasfilm, there was occasionally pressure on us to go all digital. We would say, look at the statistics. Digital is good. It's a great new way to read books, but it's flatlined, and physical books are actually on the rise.
Yeah, physical books are on the rise for the first time in a while, and that rise is pretty steady.
Yeah, because there's nothing like it. You cannot just thumb through. You can't just thumb through, you can with a physical book, and you can't hold it in your hands. A digital book is just not the same. Although, digital books are also great for travel.
Yeah, I do a lot of community theater here in Anchorage, and they often discourage having your phones backstage and whatnot, and that's one of the reasons I always have a book on me, is because I can read 2 or 3 pages in a book and set it down and go do my thing. I can't do that with my phone.
Yeah, and it's easier on the eyes for whatever reason. And,
Agreed. Also, I'm dyslexic, so digital letters they jump about.
Oh, really? That's interesting. There's something about the medium. Yeah, it's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, when you have a physical one, if you have, like for example, the books you wrote with Lucasfilm, half the joy of it's also the layout. A lot of people spend a lot of time on layout, and when it's digital, it doesn't always have the same layout or look and feel. Like, for example, if you read comics, if you have the Comixology app, it'll bounce from window to window, which helps you read. But if you have any other app, it just shows you a page, and you have to kind of zoom in and look at it.
Yeah. Anything but sort of straight text, I will not read on that.
Yeah.
My ebooks, enhanced ebooks, accepted.
So,
but that. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, so I'm just saying, while we're on the topic of Lucasfilm, so a lot of people know you from writing the making of books for Star Wars and your extensive research in the Lucasfilm archives and so on. While this book requires a very different type of research, you're not going into Lucasfilm archives where they've stored everything they've ever touched or sneezed on, and it's there. How did you do the research for this one? Like, what type of places did you go? I imagine you could, you can talk to experts, you can go to museums, you can do lots of research online nowadays. But how did you do the research for this one, and how different was it for you as a writer to do this type of research versus what you've done and become famous for in the past?
Well, that's a great question. And it's funny because in some ways it's different from what I was doing, but it's also very similar in that I consider it a behind-the-scenes saga. Except that this time I was able to, get into their heads, or at least, do my best to get into the heads of the protagonists and write what they were thinking, which I'd never do in a Star Wars or Indiana Jones book. But it is this idea of telling what was really going on as much as possible, and trying to do it. You're worried about the same things: pace, dialogue. You still want to entertain the reader. You don't want to be dry or boring. And so, but the research I did was basically going to as many primary sources as I could. There are people who wrote memoirs. Walter Dernberger, who was, von Braun's boss basically during World War II, wrote his memoirs. Theodore von Karman, who did Caltech and JPL, wrote his memoirs. And the wife of Helmut Grotrieb, I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but she wrote her memoirs. And some of these books are hard to find. Korolev's, one of his chief lieutenants, Chertok, wrote a 4-volume memoir about the Russian efforts to do Sputnik and everything. And he was right there the whole time. And Korolev's daughter wrote a giant 2-volume memoir about her father. So I went to primary sources as much as I could, and they were just really good stories. And so what you do is you combine them. And I tried to be as historically accurate as I could. And if somebody said something interesting, well, that went in the book. And usually you'd have to tweak it to make it flow. But I tried to be as faithful to the history as I could. And then, of course, there's other stuff where you have to sort of go out on your own. You talk about UFOs or Freemasonry, or the occult practices of Jack Parsons and the sex magic. But other times, I found the transcript where Kennedy and his advisors were actually talking about it. What can we do to beat the Russians? And that's where they said, well, we could go to the moon. How about that? And it's literally, there was a part where they said, and they said it. They said, well, what about, could this guy have a good idea? And Kennedy said, I don't care if it's the janitor. Whoever has a good idea, let's go with that. And so, you can't, why bother trying to make stuff up than what was better than what the people actually said, and what would actually happen? The explosions, the so many failed efforts, and then amazing sort of trajectories like von Braun touring Hitler around their secret facility in Germany, and then, 10 years later touring Eisenhower and JFK around facilities in America. I mean, who else did that? It's just such an incredible story. And so I see, and in fact, well, actually, I don't want to ruin it, but there are certain elements of cinema that also appear throughout the book, and so I felt in some ways on secure ground.
Okay, and I notice also that your flair that you've done with all your making books is definitely still here, but it looks like you were able to, I don't know, loosen up a bit. You got to be more of yourself versus more of a kind of a controlled, not a controlled dialogue, but more of, when you
that's true. Definitely true.
Yeah. When you write stuff for Lucasfilm, they have control a little bit of what you put out there versus when you write stuff for yourself, you can put whatever crazy things you want out there yourself, and it's you. Versus,
I feel like a little bit is an understatement.
Well, yeah.
How crazy did I come off in this book?
Well,
oh no, that Lucasfilm has a little bit of say when you're writing for them. I'm like, I feel like they have a little more than just a little bit of a say.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny because, I mean, having worked there and sort of you get after the first couple of years, you get an idea of what's going to be acceptable and what's not. So there is a certain amount of self-censorship that went on. But I have to say, working, because I really only had to please one person there, and that was George Lucas. And I would write, the manuscript and give him basically a rough draft, and he'd look at it. And he really was not into censorship or, cutting things out unless there was just, factually incorrect. It was a pretty open deal. Whereas I've worked for other people, I will not say in Hollywood, where yes, it was completely and utterly censored. And frankly, I wrote a book on The Force Awakens, and that book just didn't come out at all. So
yeah, sadly.
And it's not that there was anything super controversial in there. There's some institutions that just don't want anything out there, even if everybody knows about it. And George's attitude and my attitude was, people know that it's hard to make a movie, and they know that there's problems and antagonisms and arguments. What else is going to happen when it's costing $100,000 an hour? People, it's high stress. But you're right, and this was a lot more all up enabled me to sort of put a lot more of myself in there and a lot more of the stuff that I'm really passionate about. One of the things being how, particularly in the last 150 years, we've gone very fast from certain novelists and filmmakers imagining things that have become realities less than 30, 100 years later. I think and you have people like Arthur C. Clarke going, yep, that's the way it works. You imagine it first, and enough people get on board, and it becomes a reality. And I think that's one of the things that interested me about writing the book. Yeah,
he definitely, those people like Jules Verne, who wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and back then nuclear-powered submarines in the ocean wasn't necessarily, it was science fiction, and now it's there's a lot. We don't know where they are. Yeah. We'll never know, but they're there. Star Trek. Star Trek becomes life. Cell phones and so on. Talk about Star Trek.
Everything down to smartwatches. Everyone looks like Dick Tracy talking into them, like down to the silliest things. The future is now.
Or the Connect and Minority Report. Science fiction is definitely one of the biggest influencers in technology today. We see it, we like it, we make it.
Right, and that's what the earliest guys were doing. They said, I like this Jules Verne stuff. Let's make that a reality. And we're not necessarily going to make everything a reality, but I believe there are mystics who say there's nothing that you can't imagine that cannot be real.
Well, even in Metropolis, it's from the 1920s, they had Skype.
Yeah, they did.
They had video chat, and here we are casually using essentially the same technology on a Saturday morning.
Right, and then you have Brad Bird making movies like Tomorrowland, where he said, look, that vision of the 50s and 60s, that's what I want. That's what I wanted as a grown-up.
That retrofuturism.
Yeah, I don't want horrible urban sprawl. I want some kind of actual, urban planning and let's make things look beautiful, and and Buzz Aldrin has a great shirt, t-shirt or long sleeve shirt you can get on his website. It says, "Get your ass to Mars." I think so. I have one of those, and I love wearing it because that embodies, I think, where we are today. Like, enough dilly-dallying, let's get on with it.
And Kayla, you go.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I was going to say, so your book, All Up, I read a bunch of it, and it was very entertaining. But I'm also going to say that it's the kind of thing that my history teachers, when I was in my undergrad, would have been like, pick something, and then we're going to pick it apart factually. And it would have been an absolute delight to do because, like you said, it's a perfect blend of fantastical and fact. And if I had gotten to do that with your book in my undergrad, I would have talked for hours and hours about how entertaining it is and how easy it is to go from history to fiction and like make this beautiful blend of entertaining story.
Well, thanks. I'm glad to hear it. I mean, it's interesting because some parts that might seem fantastic might not be 100% verifiable, but there are people around who are pretty convinced that it happened. I mean, I'm thinking of like the Battle of Los Angeles.
Oh, yes.
Which comes along pretty early in the book, where, the eyewitnesses are describing unidentified flying objects, without a doubt. And yet, you have Spielberg who made a movie where it was just sort of all done for comedy, but people who saw this stuff, and I know somebody who's spoken to the eyewitnesses, they're categorical that it was a UFO of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
So there's other stuff in the book that's pure fantasy, but the UFO stuff, I tried to adhere it close to eyewitness accounts and things like that.
And the book doesn't really get counterfactual, and that's where historians get all like about history, about books based off history. It's all there for entertainment. None of it's like, but what if this happens? Like, that doesn't matter. This isn't what's
this is not a what if book. This is
no counterfactualism at all.
Yeah, except in one respect, which I don't want to spoil it for people. But in a sense, sometime we can maybe do a spoiler interview where we talk about certain things. But I actually pulled it back from what some people say actually happened. So because what really happened in some cases, people just wouldn't accept. They just would go, well, "That's ridiculous." It's sorry, go ahead.
I said, that's silly.
Yeah, sometimes it's just silly. William Goldman, the famous screenwriter, wrote about that in one of his books, saying, you have to obey, to some extent, the rules of the genre or expectations. He talked about a guy who sort of just walked into Buckingham Palace. Despite all the security, he just walked in and ended up face to face with Queen Elizabeth. And he said, if you put that in a movie, people just wouldn't accept it, but it actually happened.
Yeah, you're crossing into Doctor Who territory at that point.
Right.
And we're also in a time where, we are skeptical about everything now. And your book has, a lot of the eccentricities of the time. You talk about Freemasons, you talk about sex magic, you talk about, people had some, there were a lot of conspiracy theory stuff. People still believe that Kubrick created the moon landing, and their reasoning is because they saw it online. Or some weird thing. Right. But we're in a time where people believe almost anything. But if history gets too crazy, no, it definitely did not happen at all. Nope, we never did anything amazing ever. And it's kind of an odd time that we live in now, where you just have to be skeptical about the wrong things.
Well, the internet is a tool like any other tool, right? You can use a hammer to make a house, or you can smash somebody's thumb with it. And the internet is a fantastic tool, but it does enable people to sort of all get together and be very, create fringe groups with no basis in reality whatsoever. And Kubrick, you mentioned, I'm glad you brought that up, because I just happened to I've just finished writing another book about Kubrick and The Shining.
Oh yes, I remember you talking about that last time we talked to you.
Ooh, that sounds interesting.
Yeah, that was a really fun book to write, and hopefully it'll come out next year. But I learned a lot about Kubrick, and I spoke to his widow, and they just think the idea they were right there. The idea of Kubrick faking the moon landing is the most ridiculous thing they've ever heard in their life.
But also, can you imagine people thinking you're that great of like a creator of film that someone's like, you faked that? Like, sure.
Yeah.
I'll take credit for that. Why not?
There's a video expert, too, online who says it was technically impossible for them to do it, period. With the tools they had, there was no way you could fake what they did. But anyway, it was really fun to kind of bring Kubrick into All Up, because he was completely fascinated with space travel and the idea of extraterrestrial intelligence, along with Arthur C. Clarke. And in a way, we're catching up with those guys. They took it as a given that you were going to find extraterrestrial life as soon as you went out a little bit into the galaxy, even into the solar system. Herman Oberth was, perhaps a little bit of a little eccentric, but they had no problem with that idea, nor did Arthur C. Clarke. And these were highly educated people, and because of the way UFOs have been marginalized these days, and ETs, now people think that it's weird, but it's not. And you have booked. I don't know if you guys have read the book Disclosure.
No, I have not read Disclosure.
I have not. No.
If
I'm
you're
going to add
interested,
it to my Goodreads list, right?
Yeah, this was organized in Washington D.C. It was basically a never-ending line of high-ranking military government people, including astronauts and ex-CIA guys, all testifying to the existence of anti-gravity, extraterrestrials, alien flying ships, one after the other, after the other, after the other. You have books detailing, endless eyewitness accounts of highly qualified military pilots and commercial pilots saying, I've never seen anything like that, and I was flying right next to my plane for 20 minutes, I had a perfect view of it. And yet, still, the general public thinks it's only, people who are basically half mad who believe in this stuff.
Mm-hmm. I don't want to share too much because it's not my story to share, but my parents saw something here in Anchorage when they were teenagers, and they refused to speak about it because of how real it was for them. And they don't want to seem like crazy. They don't want to seem like they're crazy.
Right, because
they're like, everyone else saw it. It wasn't just us. Like, everyone else saw this thing, but that's where they'll stop talking about it because they don't want to.
Right. I had a colleague, and again, I won't name him, but his uncle was a general at Wright-Patterson who said that he had seen the alien, but he would never, because he swore, that they took an oath never to divulge it. So he said, I can tell you guys, my family, but I'll never go on record. So you have that as well. So I think it's, sooner or later it's going to be general knowledge. I'll look back upon this era as a time of sort of bizarre schizophrenia. A little bit like when, they were teaching kids to hide under the desk if an atom bomb went off, as if that was going to make any difference whatsoever.
Yeah. So
they'll say, look, there was tons and tons of evidence, and yet the general public basically was either not interested or not informed. It's a very interesting phenomenon.
So is this book going to be an audiobook by chance?
So far, not. There's no immediate plans, but I assume that one day.
Well, I just look at the Russian names and go, oh dear. Some of these names are like 40 letters long.
And they're all consonants too. There's like one vowel for 40 letters.
Yeah, unfortunately, I didn't have to pronounce stuff when I read it, and I did get, yeah. And there will be a physical component. Right now, you can only get it digitally, but I should have a physical copy. If at the very least, just you'll be able to order it through Amazon, print on demand.
Okay.
I didn't get to finish it, but till previously, the longest book I've ever read was American Gods, and this book is equally as long, if not longer. So.
Well, it is kind of scary. People are scared by the length, but it's not really longer in terms of word count than a Harry Potter book or a Game of Thrones book. it's not, and it shouldn't be boring. If you
No,
guys,
it definitely wasn't. But I've been very busy, and I didn't get to read as much of it as I would have liked to because it was very interesting.
well, I'm glad to hear that. But if you do find a boring part or something, please let me know, because that's nice about publishing age these days is, if you get enough feedback on something and it makes sense, you can change it.
And one of the questions I had was like, this book it's pretty lengthy, but like, how do you know in your process when it's done, when you have to like back away and be done with it? Like Peter Jackson running into the premiere of Lord of the Rings, tossing them the final version he was working on like 2 minutes before.
Yeah. I remember being in the office when it was the end of episode 2 and George wanted to add a shot of Anakin's hand, mechanical hand, and Padme sort of taking it. And I was in Rick McCallum's office, and it was literally the day before, I think, the digital release of the film. People were saying, it's not possible, and Rick was screaming, you want to go in and tell George it's not possible?
Especially because that's like the second to the last shot in that episode, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the last shot of the movie.
It's a big deal. Like, I'm glad that now that you say that, now I feel sad that shot almost never happened, because that's a very good shot. Ladies love the prequels. Love the prequels.
The prequels get a bad rap.
They do, but I still love them.
It's a whole other conversation. Yeah, the prequels are underestimated, and they'll slowly, there will be parity over the years between the two trilogies. But to answer your question, you're basically going on gut, and you also have to take breaks. You finish the first draft, and it's good to take a break before starting the second draft. And I took like a 5-month break, thinking that I'd pretty much done, and then I went back and cut 30,000 words.
Wow!
Because I realized, I think William Faulkner described it as drowning your darlings. You're really attached to stuff, and you just can't imagine cutting it out. You go back, if you take the time, and you realize, that it really doesn't advance the plot, and it really just slows everything down. And it's covered in other areas, so it's got to go. So, having been an editor, I think it helps. The more editing you do, if you go back and forth in editing and writing, I think it really helps the writing. And you just have to be very, dispassionate about it.
I know you have a main editor for this book, but did you have anyone to go through and be like, just to double check the history stuff? Since I know, having written things, once you write it, sometimes you forget. Not forget, but like you get used to it being there, so you kind of gloss over things when you read it through. So that's why you need the break. But do you have like a historical editor to go through, like this name is slightly wrong here, or anything like that, or was that your editor did both?
Well, the editor was making sure I was at least internally consistent.
Okay.
And I was working from nonfiction books, in terms of the research. I'm sure there's a few mistakes in there. It's inevitable. There were mistakes in the Lucas books too, and you try. I think you correct them in second edition and so on. But I had a number of readers read it. One of them was a chemistry expert and knows about engineering, and I had a German read it to make sure that all the language in German was correct and not utterly absurd or some ridiculous error. So I did the best I could. I didn't have somebody like from NASA read it, which would have been nice. So I assume that as it goes out, people will say, that part there is wrong. I'll just have to correct it.
As the head of NASA contacts you and says, we have some corrections for you. Buzz Aldrin writes you, well, this word is not right. I said, no. That would be really cool, though. Have Buzz Aldrin write you and say, I read your book.
Yeah, no, there's somebody who's recommending that I should reach out to Chris Krantz, who are still alive, and so I'm going to. I'm just a little bit hesitant because it's a fictionalized version of what happened, and I feel like they might, I don't know. I don't know them. So
yeah.
It's a little bit of
When you were primary resource hunting, was there a white whale for you? Because I feel like anytime research is done, there's like that one piece of information that you need, and you have to jump through every hoop and ILL from the most obscure little library in the middle of Australia or something to get a hold of. Was there one of those for you?
There was for a while. I felt like I didn't know enough about Korolev. And just for the people listening, Sergei Pavlovich Korolev, and I'm probably mangling his name.
You're close enough. You're close enough.
He was, this incredible titanic figure who drove a lot of the Russian space age and launched Sputnik and launched Gagarin, and really was the motor behind it. I mean, he died, and sort of the life went out of it. And there was an American biography of him which was helpful, but I just felt I didn't know him. And then I found out that his daughter had written this 2-volume book about him, but it's very hard to find. And there was a little company, and to this day, I don't know if they were in the United States or in Russia, because it's hard to tell when you're emailing people. And I think they might have been in Russia. And I said, they said they could find this book for me. They'd have to go out and find it. And I said, is it really going to be in English? And I said, oh, yeah, it's going to be in English. And I was able to get it for not that much. I think it was $70, not that much. And it took several weeks, but it showed up one day. And I was just so happy because his daughter did. She's a doctor like her mother, and did a phenomenal job of researching the life of her father, documented everything, was an eyewitness to some of the things. And so that was definitely the white whale, that 2-volume set. And I recommend it to anybody who's really interested in the space age, too.
When I was researching, when I did my senior thesis on Disney in World War II, and when I was researching his business partner of iWorks, that's the same place I went, was the story his daughter wrote about him. So helpful and useful and full of so much good information. And sadly, one of the only things out there about the poor man. He didn't get a lot of credit for a lot of the things he did for Disney and actually Universal at one point, but very interesting to find like family biographies like that.
Yeah, no, it's really helpful. And I think his grandson is now maybe doing something about it. And his grandson,
cool.
Yeah, and his grandson worked briefly at ILM. I think I published.
Oh, really? That's crazy.
I found this little letter from him about Disney and all the interconnections I thought were so fascinating, even though it didn't bear on the direct story. I think I reproduced it in I think it was the Empire book, but it's small. But I thought, when I was doing the research, I thought, that is so cool that this guy was at ILM.
Oh, that is really cool. Yeah, Jeremiah, if you don't know, iWorks is the guy who invented multiplaning.
Oh, okay.
For animation.
Yes.
Yeah, and he was also the guy who literally drew single-handedly all the early Disney cartoons.
Also true.
He was a phenomenon, and is getting more and more attention now, luckily. But it's interesting you mentioned Disney in World War II, because Walt Disney is one of the characters in the book, and for an important reason, and I'll be interested to see how people react to that, because he was probably a Freemason, but definitely part of the De Mole group, which are basically Freemasons. And if you look at his work, the Disney movie adaptations, many of them are the works of Freemason authors. And you even have Mickey Mouse cartoons, news strips, where they're forming a De Mole group. And so the whole way that sort of Freemason runs through a lot of the space age, I thought was fascinating. And I think something that could be discussed, but which is never mentioned because most people don't know about it. And also, which links to the idea of, who we are as a species. What are we? Are we morally conscious? Who are we ethically? Who are we as a species when we start to travel into space? Are we still going to be people who think it's okay to beat the crap out of our children? Or are we going to evolve from there?
And it's also interesting to see, just like us like you said, us as a species, not wanting to believe things like, even something as like for my undergrad, the World War II cartoons of Donald Duck dressed as a Nazi. If I just said that, people would not believe me. But if I sit them down and give them a lecture on the topic and then show them the cartoon, they're like, holy crap.
You mean where he's making fun of the Nazis?
No, the one in, not Commando Jack. That's the other one. Oh God, what is the name of it? No, it's one where he wakes up and he's in Nazi Germany. The Fear of Space. That's the name of that one.
I don't know if I've seen that one.
You've got it. Yeah. See, even that, like, just right there, people are like, "Oh, Disney would never do such a thing." I'm like, when you're desperate for money, you will do very crazy things.
Yeah, well, and and Disney is a controversial character because he may or may not have, informed on people to the FBI, but then he wasn't. I mean, he was a very smart guy and probably the best storyteller of the century. But then later ended up making fun of the FBI. So that's the other thing. People are not black and white. Did Verner von Braun change when he came to the United States? Probably yes, but how much did he change? Only his widow could tell, and she doesn't seem to be talking to anybody.
Did you, for this book, did you get to interview anybody that you were just really excited to meet up with and get a real version of the story?
I didn't, to be honest, I didn't try.
Oh, okay.
I didn't want to set off any alarm bells, if you will. I didn't want to be stopped. Maybe I was a little bit, I don't know if I was paranoid, but I just thought this is more of a gospel of the space age. I think what these guys did was so incredible. I think people are going to be, in the same way that Thomas Pynchon wrote Gravity's Rainbow. I think as a writer, you're interpreting it. And in a way, I wanted to keep it pure as a sort of exercise of imagination.
That makes a lot of sense.
So maybe I was sick of interviewing people.
Okay, and we're almost out of time. So before we wrap up, where can people find your book? It comes out on the 25th. That is this Thursday. Where can people find and purchase All Up?
Well, the two main places are, of course, Kindle on Amazon and on iBooks, Apple's iBooks. But you can also get it on many other platforms. It's going to be on Smashwords. Ooh. And they distribute to something like, I don't know, it seems like 15 or 16 platforms, including Google Plus, I believe, and Kobo and Barnes & Noble, and also internationally. I think you'll be able to get it in France and Germany and even Russia. And I really hope that, particularly in places like Germany and Russia, because they were so important in the first space age, I really hope people will read it in those countries, and I hope it gets translated into those languages.
That would be awesome. And, I hope the person who translates it does a really good job, because there's a lot of subtlety in here that sometimes can be lost with a translation, and you make sure you have the right person to translate it so the subtlety's not gone, because that's the biggest challenge when you translate stuff from other languages.
Well, I mean, good translating teams usually include two people, one who's native, one language and native in the one it's going into, so that they get those things right. Yeah, and it's a real art form, translating. Yeah, and I hope you're right. And yeah.
Well, it's like reading, for example, I read the Witcher books, which they're from Scandinavia. There's a games for them, but they're originally written in Polish. And the early translations when they came here, you could definitely tell they didn't have a lot of money because they didn't think anyone would read them. The newer translations are so much better because looks like the company went, oh, people are going to read this. We're going to spend money to make sure it's translated well. So it's not just like a dry, scholarly translation. It's, you have to have someone who can translate and also keep the fictional flow. You don't just have someone translate it and make it, literal word for word, because that doesn't work. I've translated stuff and it doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, there's some translations throughout, history that are miraculous, and the Germans claim that their translations of Shakespeare are better than Shakespeare. Take that for what you will. And but the King James Bible is beautifully written. And there's even one. This is a little weird, but there are some people, including Malcolm X, who thought that it may have been Shakespeare himself who did the King James version, or at least polished it or something, because it is it's on a par with Shakespeare.
I believe
that's a little esoteric. That's don't know if there's any historical foundation for that whatsoever.
But it is interesting. And thank you so much. This has been fascinating. I love talking about history. I grew up in a house where history, we watched anything historical documentaries. We read a lot of books. My dad had basically a library of history books. And I know Kayla, that's her degree, is history. So it's a subject that we love. And I love digging into books like this. Because it's fascinating. You always learn something. And if you think it's off, you can always look it up and go, oh, I was actually wrong. I've learned more now. And
that's the whole thing. I think by sort of doing that a little bit in the book, and it will hopefully inspire people to go say, well, okay, well, what actually happened in terms of what's acceptable and what's accepted, and go and find out for themselves. And if that happens, then the book has been successful. And
that's really the goal of historical-based fiction, is to make people think and, like you said, go, okay, so now I'm going to look into this myself, and that's the goal.
Right. It's like a good biopic movie. You go, okay, well, we know they didn't tell it exactly the way it happened, but now I'm so interested in X, I'm going to go find out what the reality was. But at the same time, I hope that All Up is just a really fun, entertaining read, and I think it's not like it's going to send you spiraling out of history. It's about 85% accurate, like really objectively accurate.
And then the rest is flavor, which is needed.
The rest is flavor, or poetic license. Some events are combined, that sort of thing. One character is a combination, 3 or 4 characters, the usual stuff.
Oh yeah, and American cinema, for British stories like The King's Speech, they always put Churchill in everything because Americans love him. But
he's in Transformers last night.
Odds are he wasn't. Oh, obviously for that one, but odds are for historical fiction, he probably wasn't there. But since Americans love Churchill so much, they just keep tossing him in the movies.
Well, I had so much fun writing Churchill, and Churchill really was there. And the MI6 guy was a real character, and he wrote his memoirs, R.V. Jones, and the professor Lindemann. That's a real character, and how the British were sort of trying to figure out what the Germans were up to in World War II is an incredible story, and so that was really fun writing about that. And Churchill's doctor wrote a great portrait of Churchill. He was there for all these important moments. So that was a great source of information. And Churchill is larger than life. He's such a wonderful character.
Which is probably why Americans love him so much.
Yeah.
Well, and he was half American too.
Mm-hmm.
His mother was American, so that might make him more American. Although clearly he was very typically Victorian English, so he's just great character and amazing person.
Well, thank you so much for this. And of course, people, if you want to purchase it, it's available Thursday, May 25th, basically anywhere ebooks are sold. And soon enough, hopefully a physical copy will be available so you can peruse through it while sitting on the toilet or wherever you want to read your books. But thank you.
More poetic and nice than that, Jared. Jeez.
I grew up from a house of toilet readers. You ever been in the bathroom like an hour and a half? What are you doing? Shh, I'm reading.
Oh my God.
I also have 6 siblings, and so that's pretty much the only quiet place in the house. And now I have 2 toddlers, and it's also the only quiet place in the house.
But they're not alone in the tradition of toilet reading.
But thank you so much for your time, and I hope lots of people read your book, and I actually hope you get lots of input from Germany and Russia and people that maybe you'll get responses from people inside NASA. That would be probably nervous for you to open, but fun for you to get good reactions, because it's a good read. It's a very good read, and lots of people are going to learn lots of stuff about space from it, and hopefully someone will get really excited about space again, because that's something that has always been awesome.
Well, I'm hoping that people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos also read it. And I've actually written to SpaceX and said, listen, I'd like to make this, I'll give you guys it for free, if people in your company want to read it, just because I think it'd be good. Just to spread the word. It's not just about selling books. It's like, that's as we said before, let's get this thing going again.
And let's get to space and not strand Matt Damon on Mars.
But thank you. One time. It happens one time.
Okay. Hey, well, thank you so much for having me, and I'm glad you guys have enjoyed the book so far. Hopefully you'll still say you enjoyed it when you got to the end.
Thank you so much for your time.
I'm quite sure I will. Thank you so much.